It is because I am sure that our fortunes are still in our hands, in our own hands, and that we hold the power to save the future, that I feel the duty to speak out now.
People often ask, how significant was the Iron Curtain speech? And I often reply, it changed the world. In the year 1946, Europe is still recovering in the wake of a global conflict. It's a tumultuous time politically. The world is still unstable. And it's in that context that a new threat is bubbling up in Eastern Europe. That threat is the Soviet Union. And as the Soviet Union increases its power base in post-World War II Europe, there's one man who sees it all coming, and that's Winston Churchill. And Churchill warns to anyone who will listen that this looming threat of the Soviet Union and of communism is one that needs to be reckoned with. In 1945, after VE Day in Europe, Churchill lost an election and was no longer prime minister. And it was in that environment that he receives a rather bold invitation from the president of Westminster College, Frank McClure, who invites Churchill to Fulton, Missouri. And it was here in this small mid-America town that Churchill chose to deliver arguably the most significant speech of the 20th century.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
And it is this juxtaposition of this small, rural, everyday America town, full Americana, is on display here in Fulton, where we see the world begin to change. Well, the National Churchill Museum at Westminster College is a multifaceted, multi-layered historical site. Not only did Winston Churchill deliver his Iron Curtain speech here in 1946, marking arguably the beginning of the Cold War, this is a space where we've reconstructed, stone by stone, a 17th century Christopher Wren church that was bombed in the Blitz in World War II and relocated stone by stone from London to Fulton. This was an idea that Winston Churchill himself knew about and embraced and endorsed. So we have great British history meeting great American history and creating a world history. And to cap it all off, we have 8 sections of the Berlin Wall. The concrete manifestation of the Iron Curtain that Churchill warns about is installed here on the campus of Westminster College. When Congress established this as the National Churchill Museum, we took that very seriously, and we reach audiences across the country, from coast to coast, and really throughout the world. They come here to Fulton, Missouri at Westminster College to explore Winston Churchill in a profound way. We've created exhibitions and displays that are interactive and visceral in nature. You can walk through a World War I trench and hear recordings of what it might have sounded like to be in such a trench, or you can experience the sights and sounds and almost even, if you imagine, the smells of the Blitz in London through our interactive experiences here. It's a chance for visitors to not only read about, but almost to feel history as it unfolded in some of the 20th century's most challenging hours. History comes alive here. History continues to happen here. And it's that quality of this museum that sets it apart. And visitors walk away, I think, refreshed, enriched, and continually inspired by Winston Churchill, his leadership, and his legacy. The sun never sets on the Churchill world, it seems. We're broadcasting or live streaming here live from Westminster College at America's National Churchill Museum. My name is Tim Riley. I'm the director and chief curator here. And we are this morning here in Fulton in the historic church of St. Mary the Virgin, Aldermanbury. the 17th century historic church that was originally built in London, where it stood for 300 years very proudly in service until a fateful night on December 29th, 1940, 80 years ago, when the German Luftwaffe dropped 20,000 incendiary bombs on London, nearly destroying this edifice, this building. It stood in ruins in London for nearly 25 years until it was relocated stone by stone here to Fulton, on the college campus of Westminster College, where it now stands as the largest work in the collection of America's National Churchill Museum. I'm very pleased to be joining you using 21st century technology in a decidedly 17th century setting. We will be joined shortly here by two very distinguished speakers who will be sharing with us some of their thoughts on this section, which we are calling From Yalta to Fulton to Today. And we'll explore some seminal moments at the end of World War II that transitions from World War II into the Cold War. And we'll continue our discussion by talking about how some of the legacies of those seminal moments of history still impact the world today. We are joined today by two speakers. First, Catherine Katz, author, historian, who is joining us, and her brand new book is a delightful read. If you haven't read it, it's Daughters of Yalta. It's a wonderful, wonderful look at that conference that is familiar to most Churchillians. But what is unfamiliar are the three women who played such an important role at that conference. And Catherine, who's the author of Daughters of Yalta, will be joining us. And we're also going to be joined today by Professor David Reynolds, whose book, The Kremlin Letters, documents the correspondence between Stalin, Churchill, and President Roosevelt throughout the war. It also is a terrific and excellent resource. So we're in very, very good hands today as we're joined by these wonderful speakers. The way it will work is we'll listen first to Catherine Katz, who will speak for about 15 minutes or so, then from Professor Reynolds, then we'll join the three of us to take your questions for these distinguished speakers and explore this conversation in depth. So first up, I'd like to welcome and introduce Catherine Katz, whose new book, as I mentioned, Daughters of Yalta, is a must-read if you haven't already read it. It just came out, and we're very, very delighted to have you with us from Chicago, Catherine. Welcome to Fulton virtually and to the world via this Churchill Conference. Catherine, we're very pleased to have you with us. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It is such a pleasure to be joining you today. I am so excited for a number of reasons, also personally to be able to do this with Professor Reynolds, who was my supervisor at Cambridge. So this is great fun, not only for the content, but also the gathering of individuals we have today. So I wanted to start today by sharing a very famous photograph with you. This is the famous photograph from the Yalta Conference. It was taken on February 8th, 1945, and it shows the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, with their military leaders gathered behind them. From their faces, you can see that the toll of the war has been heavy, and also the last few days debating over the outcome of the post-war world and their hopes for peace have really been weighing on their minds. But we also discount what it took to get there. To get to Yalta, it meant Churchill and Roosevelt had to come to Stalin. Stalin, at this point, he's claiming that his doctors advised him against traveling. It would be bad for his health. But in reality, he doesn't want to leave the safety of his security apparatus in the Soviet Union. And over the course of the war, the balance of power has shifted. The Soviet Union is on the rise, while Britain's power is significantly diminished. So Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to make this long voyage, thousands of miles, Churchill first by air, and very tragically, one of their planes carrying Foreign Office representatives is lost on the way. FDR has to make the voyage by sea with a ship convoy, and they're still sighting U-boats on their way there. So this is an incredibly dangerous and arduous journey. They meet first in Malta, where they have a planning session together before then flying a further almost 1,400 miles to the Crimea. And this is flying over enemy-occupied territory where there are still enemy anti-aircraft units. And it's a very, very dangerous trip, one that we can't imagine any leaders who are meeting for a grand summit would undertake today. Once they arrive in the Crimea, they're meeting at Levadia Palace on the Black Sea. This was once the summer palace of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. It was a lovely retreat away from the hustle and bustle of court, and they really did treat it as a family home. This palace is the embodiment of contradictions between extreme graciousness and splendor, but also primitiveness and destruction that lies just beyond the grounds. The Crimea has been scarred by years of war, but also by the Soviet state-sponsored famine that came before it. And while this palace is beautiful and it has all the trimmings of royalty, the surrounding areas have been absolutely devastated. And until just 3 weeks before the conference, Levadia was in a similar state. The Nazis had used Levadia Palace as their Crimean headquarters. And when the Soviets finally pushed them out of the Crimea just shortly before this, they took everything with them of value that they could carry. They absolutely stripped the palace, taking the furniture, the art, the lamps, even down to the doorknobs, and there was nothing left. So the Soviets had to entirely restock this villa using the contents of places like the Hotel Metropole and the Hotel National, and carting everything by train 1,000 miles south to the Crimea to put together a makeshift environment for the week of this very important conference. Once at Yalta, they were discussing many issues about the post-war world. There are four main topics of conversation that I want to focus on here just briefly as a reminder. We think today of Yalta as at this moment on the precipice between World War and Cold War, but at the time they are still very hopeful for a positive outcome and hopefully a lasting peace. The war in Europe is finally drawing to an end. The race is on to see who will liberate Berlin. Pacific, they're still not quite with the end in sight, but things are improving. So one of the four main issues is what to do about Germany in the post-war world. Should Germany be allowed to be a one state, or should it be broken into smaller states in hope that they will not be able to rise up in belligerence once more? Also very important is the matter of Polish sovereignty. Britain went to war to guarantee Polish sovereignty at the outset, and Churchill doesn't want to return home from Yalta without being able to make this honest agreement with his colleagues, the Polish government in exile that's been in London since the beginning of the war, to say that he wants to say that the reason we went to war is we will be successful in the end. But Stalin has other ideas, no matter what he's saying publicly. The Soviet Union is determined to have friendly neighbors on their borders. They've been invaded through Poland multiple times throughout history, and he wants to make sure that at the end, the government in Poland is going to be friendly to the interests in Moscow. And unfortunately for Churchill, Stalin's Red Army is firmly in control of the area. Also very important to Franklin Roosevelt is hopefully drawing the Soviets into the war in the Pacific. The Soviets and the Japanese have long had a pact of neutrality. At this point, FDR doesn't yet know if the atomic bomb will be successful. So he's looking at a potential invasion of the home islands at potentially a cost of 200,000 American lives. And so he's hoping to draw the Soviets into the Pacific in exchange for territorial concessions in hopes of saving as many Americans as possible. And finally, there's the matter of forming the United Nations. This is very important to FDR personally. He wants to succeed where Wilson has failed with the League of Nations after World War I. And while he doesn't believe that it's realistic to imagine you could secure peace forever, he does believe it's possible to have 50 years of peace in Europe. And he also sees the United Nations as a way of drawing the Soviet Union into the international community in the post-war world. So we look at this photograph, and this is an example of a moment in history that we think we know so well. Yalta has been written about many times. However, this is also an image that is a bit of a red herring in a sense, because there's another photograph taken from just a slightly different angle at the same moment, and you can see a different picture. Just off to the side, you can see the shapes of two women. There were actually three women there. These women are the daughters of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ambassador Averell Harriman. Sarah Churchill was 30 years old. You can see her in her military uniform. Anna Roosevelt in the middle is 38, and Kathleen Harriman is just 27. And so I became very fascinated. What is the role of these three women there? What was their place in one that we know so little about? Very little has been written about them, and yet they occupied this fascinating role where they're both daughters and diplomats. And also, it says something significant about the relationship between these daughters and their fathers, that of all the people they could have chosen to take with them as their aides at Yalta, why did these fathers choose to bring their daughters? It also casts a much more personal light on the Yalta Conference, because we think of these summits of history, these great men of history in all capital letters, we put them up on a pedestal, and sometimes that history can feel very out of touch for people. But at the end of the day, these people are humans like anyone else, and they're also someone's father. And what would it be like to be one of the people in the world who looks at these individuals who we revere, but they think of them just as dad? So I'll stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about each of the women. So Sarah Churchill, as I mentioned, was 30 years old. And if you know her, sometimes you know her as an actress. She was in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. But before this, as a child, she was very close to her father. She was very shy and nervous at times, but she felt that she had this bond with her father and that she understood the way his mind worked. Even if they weren't speaking, she felt that they were very much in harmony. And some of this came from her childhood experience of spending long hours with him in the gardens of their home at Chartwell, where he would be engaged in one of his favorite pastimes of bricklaying, and Sarah was his chosen assistant. Sarah would end up going into the theater, one of the few careers open to women of her position and class at the time, albeit a rebellious decision, but one that her father didn't completely oppose. They were at odds very briefly when she decided to run off with the star of her show, who was significantly older than she was and an Austrian citizen. But the marriage didn't last, sadly, and by the time the war came, it was largely over. And Sarah decides that she wants to leave the stage and do her bit for her country, as inspired by her father. And so she decides to join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the women's branch of the RAF, where she becomes an aerial reconnaissance intelligence officer. And Sarah, she goes on to be highly informed of the very detailed specifics of Allied operations, such as the operations in the Mediterranean. And Winston's very proud of his daughter for her work, sometimes bragging about her, sometimes even going so far as to accidentally leak classified information in sharing his pride about her. But when it comes time for the Tehran Conference, the first meeting of the Big Three, he decides to take Sarah with him as his aide at Tehran, where her background as an actress and her experience as a WAF has given her this wonderful balance of the interpersonal relationships needed in diplomacy, as well as the technical expertise. And at Tehran, Franklin Roosevelt and Averell Harriman both realize what an asset she is to her father and just how valuable this daughter diplomat role can be. Kathleen Harriman, at 27, was the youngest of the three women. She is the daughter of William Averell Harriman, the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Prior to the war, he had been the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad, the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, Newsweek magazine, the ski resort Sun Valley. He's one of the wealthiest men in America. And they did not have an especially close relationship when she was a little girl. And it's only after her mother dies when she's a teenager that they find their way back to each other through this shared love of sport and adventure. She spends her college vacations working with him at Sun Valley. And when the war breaks out and Franklin Roosevelt taps Averell Harriman to become the Lend-Lease envoy in London, Harriman decides to be a wonderful opportunity for his daughter Kathleen to come with him and have this experience of working as a war reporter in the middle of the Blitz. So with Harry Hopkins' assistance, he secures a visa for her, and off she goes and spends the next 4 years at her father's side. Once in London, they become very close friends with the Churchill family. They're even celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday when they learn about the news about Pearl Harbor. And in 1943, when Harriman becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union, Kathleen again goes with him. She learns Russian for both of them, becomes very skilled in this way. And she really has more access to Stalin's inner circle than any other American woman in history. Their relationship is in a sense more like business colleagues or business partners, not so much the warm and fuzzy relationship between a father and daughter, but she really becomes indispensable in a role that's somewhat like his assistant ambassador, or even what we would consider a protocol officer at the State Department today. And with her skills in Russian, she can act as a liaison between the Americans and the Soviets as they are making the arrangements for Yalta and handling some of these lesser seen but vitally important issues of diplomacy that are necessary to make sure that everyone feels respected and one of these roles where if something were to go wrong, you would notice her presence, but because she did such a good job, she almost doesn't get the praise that she deserves. Finally, Anna Roosevelt, who is the oldest of the three, at 38, she's a mother of three. And of the three women, she has the least experience in politics and foreign policy specifically. Her training was as an editor. She and her husband, John Boettiger, run the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And it's only after her husband joins the army that Anna decides to move back home to the White House. And this is very personally important for Anna because she and her father had a very close relationship when she was a little girl. She has these wonderful memories of riding on horseback with him through the fields and the forests around their home in Hyde Park with a shared love of the natural world. But it was after his paralysis that she really becomes very distant from him. The needs that he has at the time kind of leave very little room for her. And so she sees this as a chance to recapture the memories of childhood with her father. But once she arrives there, she realizes something about him is not quite right. He is not as sharp as he once was. He's staring off into space for long periods of time, and she's very concerned. Her mother, Eleanor, doesn't seem to realize anything is amiss, but Anna insists that he has a comprehensive medical examination, and it reveals that he is dying of congestive heart failure and only has a short time to live. And so Anna, keeping this secret, FDR doesn't want to know anything about his health, and he doesn't ask. Eleanor similarly doesn't want to know, can't bring herself to see that something has changed. So Anna carries this burden of the secret of his health and tries to really become his gatekeeper, determining who should have an audience with him, who can meet with someone else, sometimes taking papers out of his inbox and distributing them to others who can handle them so he doesn't have to be bothered, really trying to save him as much as possible. And when the time comes for Yalta, even though FDR doesn't know the state of his health exactly, he must sense that something is different because he cables Churchill and says, "If you're thinking of bringing Sarah again, I'm thinking of bringing Anna to this conference." This is not a role she'd ever been asked to play in his life before, but off she goes to Yalta with him, really protecting him as much as possible, both from himself and from others who want to meet with him. And so through the eyes of these daughters at Yalta, we can see a much more personal side of this history, where the personal and the political are intimately intertwined. At the core of this conference, it's really a story of relationships among nations, relationships among leaders, and these relationships between these fathers and daughters that have long gone underappreciated. We can see through Anna's eyes the fervent belief that FDR has that he can make this personal breakthrough with Stalin to bring the Soviets into the international community once the common enemy has been vanquished. And you can see also the tragedy of how he tries and tries, but this is ultimately unsuccessful. You can also see the struggle that Anna has as his daughter, knowing that the end is near and there's nothing she can do. But also how this is frustrated, her attempts are frustrated by her own father, who kind of keeps everybody at an arm's length. And she even goes so far as to say, he knows no man and no man knows him, and even his own family doesn't know anything about him. And you can see this in the way that he does operate somewhat enigmatically. He keeps the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, at an arm's length. He's very skeptical of involving the State Department and really wants to conduct policy and diplomacy in a very personal way. And unfortunately, in the case of Stalin, this doesn't work terribly well. Through the late night conversations at Yalta between Kathleen Harriman and Averell Harriman, you can see how frustrated Averell Harriman has become at this point with the policy pursued by Roosevelt. He's significantly more skeptical about the Soviet intentions and their willingness to keep their word after Yalta. And though his views are much more in line with Winston Churchill at this point, there's very little he can do because he is the representative to Franklin Roosevelt. And finally, through the eyes of Sarah, you can see a different side of Winston. I think people like to focus on statements he makes, like, "If only I could dine with Stalin once a week, we'd have no trouble." But there's a much more nuanced view that he has of Stalin and their willingness to continue this alliance after the common enemy is gone. Through Sarah's eyes, you can see the real trepidation he has at this time, both about his fraying relationship with FDR, as well as the willingness of Stalin to truly cooperate. And even though he goes home from Yalta making these statements in a very positive way about the success they have had at Yalta, that's not really the case of what he feels inside. Sarah is a window into the soul of Winston at this time, and really a sort of conscience of the conference. She says that she walks with him in silent step, understanding his thoughts, even the ones that he leaves unsaid. And you can see this in the way that she writes to her mother about her superstitions at the conference, kind of deriving this outlook from her father's trepidations. You can see it in the first meeting her father and FDR have when they meet at Malta. She can sense something has changed. And not knowing about his health, she wonders whether there's something wrong with him physically, or if he's just moved away from this warm and close relationship that he and Winston Churchill had had. Through the late night conversations that Sarah and Anthony Eden and Lord Moran, Churchill's doctor, have, kind of acting as a privy council of sorts at Yalta, you can see Sarah trying to channel the emotions and frustrations her father has in a productive way before they go into the conference room to discuss the important issues at hand, and really trying to channel these thoughts into the best version that they can be. But Sarah is also very important in this role that she plays with her father, because she is a connection to the regular people and the sense that they have as the world is changing in a way that her father really can't see. Through her work as a WAF, she interacts with different types of British people all the time, her various colleagues who have different backgrounds, and she can feel the shifting sands of domestic politics and the sense that they have of having given so much and sacrificed so much during the war, which they were very willing to do. But in the post-war world, there's a different expectation and a different need that they had that her father doesn't yet recognize. And Sarah also has an opportunity at Yalta to go with the other two daughters and visit the local community and to see the regular people in the Crimea whose lives have been devastated by this war and whose futures are in the hands of her father and the other fathers who are debating with Stalin in the conference room. And after witnessing this devastation, Sarah returns home and to Levadia Palace after Churchill has had a long day of tussling with Stalin over the future of Poland. And they express their anxieties to each other. And Winston says to Sarah, "I do not suppose that at any moment in history has the agony of the world been so great or widespread. Tonight, the sun goes down on more suffering than ever before in the world." And so at the end of Yalta, even though the three leaders dispatch a triumphant cable proclaiming the success of the conference, and Churchill goes home to sell his colleagues on what is a very optimistic outlook, what he says publicly is not necessarily what he feels inside. And perhaps the most honest, unvarnished view into his soul and his outlook on the future is just at the end of Yalta, when Sarah and Winston are standing on the ship, the HMS Franconia, looking out at the destroyed city of Sevastopol that Sarah saw with the other daughters during the conference. And she turns to her father and asks him if he's tired. And he says, strangely enough, no. And yet I have felt the weight of responsibility more than ever before. And in my heart, there's anxiety. And so you can see these two sides, the public and the private views of Winston Churchill and his anxiety about the future and the relationship with the Soviet Union through the eyes of Sarah in a more personal way than we have been able to see before.
Well, thank you, Catherine. That really is a fascinating look and a great lens through which to approach Yalta. It's a fascinating topic, and there's much more in your book. I wish we could spend 2 hours talking just about this, but we will now turn to Professor Reynolds, who will pick up the discussion and take us from Yalta as a starting point, and then on into Fulton and beyond. So I'm pleased to welcome, in some ways, virtually at least, back to Westminster College. I believe you were here in 2002 as a Tyler Fellow, and it's great to see you again. Professor Reynolds is also with Christ College at the University of Cambridge, and as I mentioned, his recent book, The Kremlin Letters, Stalin's Wartime Correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt, is a must-have resource for understanding the relationship between the three men. I think as Catherine's book is about the three daughters, and David's captures very well the intimate, in some ways, correspondence between the big three leaders. So, David, welcome back.
Thank you, Tim. And let me just put up my screen. Here we are. So I think what I want to say is it follows on rather well from what Catherine's talked about, though we haven't had a conspiracy about plotting the two talks. I want to follow on from what she said by talking more about the aftermath. But she has set up what I want to talk about very well. And as you can hear from just that brief preview in her book, this is a fascinating new impression of the conference and of what goes on behind the scenes. And certainly something, if you're looking for a Christmas present for deserving relatives or indeed undeserving relatives, it's well worth purchasing. So I don't get a commission on this, but I'm just saying. So I want to talk about Yalta to Fulton via the unthinkable. And some of you will know what I'm talking about. Others will find out hopefully in a few minutes. So Catherine has shown us two pictures of Yalta, one rather grim-faced and another not so grim. This is one that I am particularly fond of, a much more cheerful picture after the formal photos have been taken. And as Catherine said, if we just focus on Poland, this is a problematic conference. But Roosevelt and Churchill knew it was going to be problematic. Roosevelt said, bearing in mind that the Red Army was already in occupation of Poland, he said to senators before he left Washington, D.C., you know, the only thing we can do is try and ameliorate the situation, make it better, ameliorate it. Churchill said before he left in one of his gloomy moments, there's nothing I can do for poor old Poland. They fought their best, but they knew that what they'd got on Poland was one that reflected the fact that Stalin held the best cards. But on the other hand, as Catherine said, Yalta is about other issues as well. On Germany, Churchill fights his corner very hard. He blocked Soviet demands for reparations payments, agreement on reparations payments, much to Stalin's irritation. He is able to postpone issues about the dismemberment of Germany. And Roosevelt gets what he wants, which is looking ahead to American entry, Russian entry into the Pacific War, and bringing the Soviet Union into what he called at Tehran the family circle, into the United Nations. Now, we can debate the pros and cons of those policies, but the point I'm making is that these men leave Yalta, each of them, I think, with the feeling they had gained something, they'd got something. In other words, Yalta had a sense of this being, in the round, a diplomatic negotiation in which there was give and take, as Roosevelt admitted to the Congress. And the intention, of course, was that these three would meet again at the end of the war with Germany to continue the planning of peace. So a meaningful conference, but one in which the stakes are high. And Roosevelt and Churchill, it's quite remarkable the degree they go to when they come home of trying to sell what's happened, particularly over Poland, to a skeptical Congress and in part a hostile House of Commons. And whatever Churchill's concerns and fears, as Catherine has said in private, he goes OTT about some of what's been gained and what that agreement on Poland is about, and in particular the possibility of trusting the Soviets. So he says to the Commons that he comes back from Yalta with the feeling that Stalin and the Soviet leaders, as far as they're concerned, their word is their bond. And he goes even further with a meeting of ministers on the 23rd of February 1945. And I put the words up on the screen because they are quite remarkable. Poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin. And I think those comments are worth pondering for a moment, because he is very much a split personality, as Catherine has said and has brought out very insightfully with regard to Sarah. Winston has deep doubts about this. He is, after all, a man who campaigned against Bolshevism, what he called the foul baboonery of Bolshevism, all through his life since the end of the First World War. But he was quite clear in June 1941 that any enemy of Hitler had to be an ally of Britain. And he has put his money into that. And this whole relationship with Stalin was not one in any way that he could have imagined when he became prime minister. On May the 10th, he becomes prime minister. 5 days later, in 1940, his basic expectation about fighting the war, the French, the alliance with the French, falls apart. And from then on, Churchill is having to improvise. Everything about his wartime achievements is, if you like, an improvisation from a starting point that he never expected in May, June 1940. And that's part, I think, of his achievement. So what he ends up with, I think, are two special relationships. The obvious one is, the natural one is with Franklin Roosevelt. Natural because of the bond of the common language, the fact Churchill is half American, the closeness of the cultural relationships between the two countries. The unnatural one, but necessary one, is an alliance with the devil, if you like, with the Soviet Union, with Stalin. There they are together in August 1942. Churchill, all through the war, wrestles with the enigma of the Soviet Union and of Stalin in particular. And the fact that he can get messages from Stalin which are very cordial, and messages from Stalin which are really abusive and rude and so on. And he, in trying to understand this man, he comes up with the notion of what I call the two Stalins. And to illustrate it, here's a message he sends to the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, in March 1943, referring to two telegrams he's got on the same day, the 15th of March. One of them very cordial, thanking him for sending a film about the Battle of Alamein and all the rest of it, promising a film about Stalingrad. The other really blunt and really aggressive about why there's been no second front. And Churchill says that these two telegrams, these contradictory telegrams, reinforce his sense that there are two forces to be reckoned with in Russia. Stalin himself, personally cordial to me. Stalin in council, a grim thing behind him, which we and he have both to reckon with. So Stalin and I get on personally, one-on-one. But behind Stalin, there are these dark forces in the Kremlin, the Politburo, the Red Army marshals, whatever it is, nobody quite knows, which constrain him. Now, that is not an image that most historians of the Soviet Union would countenance today, but that is part of what Churchill comes up with to try and understand the challenges of dealing with Stalin. And also, I think, is a way to persuade himself that what he's doing makes sense, because it goes so much against the grain of him as an anti-Bolshevik. The feeling that Stalin is, all things considered, a kind of moderate in the Kremlin constellation of forces, if you like. So it's this positive sense of Stalin, the man that if he can, as Catherine mentioned, you know, is Stalin, he says in January 1944, if only Stalin and I could meet once a week, there would be no trouble at all. We get on like a house on fire. That's one of the positive quotations. At other times, he's extremely bleak about the whole relationship, but he has no choice. And that's the point I'm making. Leadership in adversity, which is the theme of our conference, is about making the best of a bad situation. Or as somebody else said, more in a more contemporary idiom, you don't choose your inbox. You have to deal with the problems that are on your desk. And that's what Churchill is trying to do. And that's part of the greatness of a leader, is actually to be able to try and make something out of a really bad situation. Okay, so there they are at Yalta. That's a chummy picture. Stalin, even in his platform, he was slightly shorter than Winston. And if you want to pick up more about what I've just been talking about, the Kremlin letters, which I did with a Russian colleague, Vladimir Pochatnov, and that was a wonderful experience for a Russian historian and a British historian to work together at a time when neither of our countries are getting on very well together. And then the chapter on Yalta, in the book I wrote about summits, there's more detail about what I'm saying there. But let me move on then from Churchill coming back from Yalta, trying to sell, fingers crossed, that deal. The problem is that very quickly it's clear that the situation in Poland is deteriorating. The Red Army are taking control. The so-called Polish Committee of National Liberation, which is a Moscow front organization of communists, is taking control of the political government behind the Red Army. The deal that had been made about a coalition government and free elections was always very vague. Admiral Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, said it was elastic, highly elastic, and Stalin is stretching it as far as he wants in March 1945. Churchill writes to Roosevelt in growing agitation on the 8th of March 1945 that he felt that Poland is the test case between us and the Russians of the meaning which is to be attached to such terms as democracy. But Roosevelt is still focused on that bigger picture that Catherine mentioned, the importance of keeping the alliance going, to fight Japan, to form the United Nations. The inaugural conference is coming up in April, and he doesn't want to bring matters to a head. So in early April, he retreats to Warm Springs, his cottage in Georgia, and he's there. He is working on the keynote address that he is going to deliver to the inaugural conference of the United Nations in San Francisco on the 25th of April. That is the image of Roosevelt in early April, and those are the headlines on the 13th of April, the day after Roosevelt's death. Truman takes over. The Ninth Army, US Ninth Army, is crossing the Elbe River, nearing Berlin. So just at the climax of the war, the alliance, if you like, is unhinged. Unhinged in the sense that I think both those two men, Churchill and Roosevelt, relied in certain ways on each other. The relationship's different in 45 from what it was in 41, but it is still a partnership. There are times when Churchill pushes Roosevelt onwards. There are times when Roosevelt says to Winston, look, don't make a drama out of every crisis every day. And I think for Churchill, it's a really unsettling moment. And I'll come back to that in a minute or so. So Churchill soldiers on. There is the moment of triumph, 8th of May, 1945. There he is in Whitehall, wonderful picture. You can just see the hat right in the middle of the sea of happy people. But on the 12th of May, he writes to Truman, the new president, an iron curtain is drawn down upon their front. He says, surely it is vital now to come to an understanding with Russia or see where we are with her before we weaken our armies. And his remedy is, this can only be done by a personal meeting. In other words, we need to talk to Stalin again. That is the only hope of trying to deal with this situation. That's Churchill's policy in all this. And given where the Red Army is in 1945, there seems to be no alternative to that. No alternative to trying to negotiate on Poland with the Soviet Union. Or is there no alternative? In the middle of May, Churchill suddenly starts to think the unthinkable. That's the top page of a top secret report by the Joint Planning Staff to Churchill on what they call Operation Unthinkable. Churchill has asked them to develop a contingency plan for how to get a square deal for Poland by the use of force, not negotiation. And the planners take a deep breath. They say this is totally crazy, but they tell him that it would be possible to muster perhaps 40 or so British and American divisions in Germany to drive east round Dresden and with support up the Baltic coast, naval and air support, and force the Red Army back. But they also warn, if our political object is to be achieved, the defeat of Russia in a total war will be necessary. In other words, this is not going to be a limited war. It will escalate to total war. The result is not possible to foresee, but to win it, it would take us a very long time. We must envisage, the planners say, a worldwide struggle. In other words, if you want to do this, it's World War III. Churchill recoils in horror. He now asks what actually is there to stop the Red Army getting to the Channel. And the whole planning document is put in the archives with the code name Operation Unthinkable. And if you're interested in pursuing it, you can just Google it from the National Archive in London's website, and you can see some of the documents that I just put up. So let's just pause again then, rather with, as I did with that comment that Churchill made about Neville Chamberlain in February 1945. How do we explain this demand for a contingency plan for war against a country that was our ally less than 2 weeks before, using the forces of the former enemy? Because one of the premises is that we will have to use German manpower. I mean, this is really unthinkable. And it seems to me that this is testimony first to how exhausted Churchill is from 5 years of war. And that's clear from the diaries of Lord Moran, his doctor, the comments of Edward Bridges, the cabinet secretary. This is a man who is really worn out. It's also testimony to his frustration at not being able to get a deal for Poland. And as Catherine said, Britain entered the war officially in September 1939 in support of Poland. And Churchill does feel this as a debt of honor. He uses that phrase at Yalta. And also at the deepest level, a feeling, I think, for Churchill that May 1945, if he looks back over those previous 5 years, this is not the outcome of that struggle that he embarked on as Prime Minister. This is not the outcome he ever wanted. A divided Europe, a hostile Europe, teetering on the edge of conflict again. I mean, there must be a huge sense of desperation. And some of what I'm talking about here, and I think what Catherine talked about earlier, suggests the sense of triumph and tragedy that Churchill feels for himself, as well as for Europe and for Britain at the end of the war. So over the next few months, Churchill soldiers on, but he finds that Truman is increasingly determined to do his own thing. Here we are at Potsdam in July 1945, another sort of happy scene, 3 leaders. But basically, Churchill is now marginalized. Truman and his Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, are sorting out a deal over German reparations and Polish borders with the Russians and putting the British on the side. And of course, a few days later, the removal vans are there outside Downing Street because Churchill has lost the election. And for those of you who are listening from America, of course, it's worth remembering that you have a leisurely 2 months or so transition. In Britain, it's pretty brutal. If you lose the election, you're out the next day. And indeed, Churchill has nowhere to go, and he has to be. He's helped by his daughter Diana, and her husband, who provide the accommodation while he and Clementine are looking for somewhere to live. So this is a pretty bad time. Nevertheless, Churchill is Churchill. He gradually recovers. He's helped by a trip to Italy. He's helped by the therapy of painting. And by the way, that was an absolutely wonderful talk yesterday, that session about painting, and really enjoyed it. But it testifies to the power of painting for Churchill as a leader faced with adversity. And then there are other things. He gets lots and lots of speaking invitations, and one of them catches his fancy. give a speech in the United States. Now, I don't wish to be in any way disrespectful to our friends at Fulton, but at this stage, Westminster College is not quite as famous as Harvard or Yale. And it is in the middle of the country. Even worse, as far as Churchill is concerned, it's a Presbyterian college and a dry campus. Nevertheless, Churchill decides to go because of the postscript on the letter that he will be introduced by the President of the United States. And there's the famous picture. There's Truman with his mortarboard on, sitting beside Churchill. And the point of that, for a man who has been thrown out by the British public, in his view, is that this will be a chance to resurrect himself as a leader again. So just finally, I want to go through that speech, because when I think Alan Packwood introduced it, he referred to the famous words, and here they are. And I've got the annotated copy of Churchill's speech here, courtesy of the indefatigable Alan, provided by the Churchill Archive Centre. There's the line about the Iron Curtain descending across the continent. But Churchill has other things to say in that speech, and it's worth remembering them, and because they pick up some of the things I talked about earlier. First of all, he says that it's important that there is no appeasement of the Soviets. What is needed, he said, is a settlement, and a settlement early. Mustn't delay it. How do we get a settlement? He says, the Russians, there is nothing they admire as much as strength, and nothing for which they have less respect than weakness, especially military weakness. And these annotations, by the way, are made by Joe Sturdy, his secretary, in the light of what he said at Fulton. So not strength, not weakness. Where do you get the strength? This is now Britain is a financially weakened country after the war, no longer such a great power as it was. Answer, Churchill emphasizes the special relationship, a term he started to use in 1943 between the British Commonwealth and the Empire, and the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States. In other words, that combination will give the strength that's needed to deal with the Soviets. Deal in the sense of fighting them? No, Churchill says. What we must now do is to reach a good understanding at all points with Russia, under the authority of the United Nations, supported by the whole strength of the English-speaking world. And then the title that he finally comes up with on the train on the way to Fulton, he says, there is the solution which I respectfully offer to you in this address, to which I have given the title, The Sinews of Peace. The Sinews of Peace. That was Churchill's title, not Iron Curtain. And it's a play on, I think, on the adage that money is the sinews of war. What he's saying is negotiation from strength represents the sinews of peace, the muscles, what gives peace its strength. So that, I think, brings us back to some of the things he said to Truman in that letter of telegram of 12th of May, 1945. And it reminds us that Churchill, if you like, looked into the abyss in the middle of May with Operation Unthinkable. And he decided that the unthinkable was not acceptable. So when he comes back to power in the 1950s, he is talking about picking up the threads of the relationship again. He introduces this phrase, parley at the summit. Parley is sort of some wonderfully sort of Shakespearean word, really. It's not easy to see how matters could be worsened by another parley at the summit. And at the House of Commons, just after he becomes Prime Minister, he says in November 51 that we need a supreme effort to bridge the gulf between the two worlds, between the two blocks, to move on from the frightful waste of Cold War. Never must we admit that a third world war is inevitable. So that's where I want to close, but just to remind you that, of course, summits is another word that is a word that we still use in conversation all the time about international relations. And it does underline the fact that this man, who was a great war leader, was also a great wordsmith. If you think of these three phrases, Iron Curtain, special relationship, and summit, they're all part of the lexicon of diplomacy to the present day. Churchill was a believer in words, in the power of words. As he said in 1938, words are the only things that last forever. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David. And I certainly agree. And all of us here who live with the echo of that speech that seems to be resonating in the gymnasium, the historic gymnasium on this campus where the Sinews of Peace address was given 75 years ago, believe in the power of words too. You both have presented a terrific look at Yalta and beyond. And you have generated a great deal of questions that have been coming to me from around the world. So I think in the time that remains, I'd like to talk about some of these questions that have come up and continue our conversation. We've titled this session From Yalta to Fulton to Today, and hopefully in the time that remains, we can talk a little bit about the today part of the legacy of these two great moments, Yalta and the speech here at Westminster College. But the first question is from the UK. It comes from Elliot, and it is how important in general terms was it for Churchill to be accompanied by a member of his family when he was traveling? The Yalta Conference, and Sarah, was not the only time that someone from his family traveled with him, and maybe you can address that.
Yes. So early in the war, the Churchills as a family decided that whenever Winston would travel abroad, he would travel with a member of his family as well, partially as kind of a protector and confidant, so he would have a trusted audience to reveal the deep anxieties that he had. But also the Churchills were very aware that they would be important to history and wanted to have someone at his side as an almost unofficial family historian as well, to make notes and to write letters and just collect the memories of what was going on, not just in the conference room for the official record, but also surrounding it. Various members of his family acted in this capacity throughout the war. The reason why he often turned to his children is also because Clementine Churchill was very afraid of flying. She tried to avoid it as much as possible. Sarah goes with to both Tehran and Yalta, Mary, of course, to Potsdam. And Randolph Churchill also kind of makes a brief appearance at both of these two conferences as well. And so it's kind of this twofold, protector, confidant, but also official record keeping, which I think is really interesting, kind of their self-awareness of their place in history as they were living through it.
And of course, Sarah traveled to the United States when Churchill came before the Iron Curtain speech. He traveled first to New York, then spent a goodly amount of time in January and February in Miami Beach, where a lot of his thoughts and words matter even more when you're on vacation on the beach, I suppose, for Churchill. And he used that much needed time to relax and refresh. And I believe Sarah joined them there. Did not make the trip to Fulton, regrettably, until much later. Sarah did come to Westminster College many years after, but that's terrific. And David, a question for you. Someone asks rightfully, words matter, and to the today part of this, someone asks, I think the bold question we're often asked here: what are the Iron Curtains of today? In geopolitics, the Cold War is over in many respects, but as someone said to me last week, it's feeling chilly, and they weren't talking about autumn. They were talking about the current climate, and perhaps you can use your knowledge as an historian and how history matters to address that question. I know you've written about the special relationship today, but perhaps tackle that question for us. That is very thoughtfully sent us by Jacob from Westminster College.
Right. So, what are the Iron Curtains today? Yes. No, it's a good question, and I think I might go to it through also the question of what can leaders meeting face to face do about those Iron Curtains. both Churchill and Roosevelt had profound belief in the power of personal diplomacy and personal relationships. And of course, I think it's true of most politicians who get to the top. They get to the top because they are actually good in one way or another with people, either with arm twisting in private and cajoling, or presenting themselves to the public. And they were doing that in an age where it was possible to communicate with a larger audience relatively easily through the mass media, through radio and television. And they were also doing it just at the stage when air travel had made it possible to go and meet with other leaders in a way which didn't take out weeks of your time. Neville Chamberlain, I think, really the first person who did this, going to see Hitler, which was an absolute gobsmacking moment for most people, the idea that he was going to fly and talk to the German Chancellor. Now, my point in saying all this, is that it's not clear to me that the kind of problems we're now dealing with are so susceptible of that kind of personal intervention, both dramatically. Imagine Nixon's trips to China and Russia in 1972, or in terms of making breakthroughs with leaders. If you think of the recent summits that Donald Trump has had, I mean, with both Kim Jong-un and Putin, both of those in summer of 2018, the Kim Jong-un one was largely theatrical. I think it had no effective substance. It hasn't changed the relationship with North Korea. And the same with relations with Putin. So you're dealing with questions, really, I think, that are in many cases less susceptible to personal diplomacy. And on the other hand, maybe more susceptible to alliance relationships. And so one of the concerns at the moment, I mean, Churchill is so emphatic in that speech about the importance of the cooperation across the Atlantic that he never envisaged in 1946 NATO, but that has been an important part of the future since his day. And that Western alliance, I think, for many people, is an important element which has become somewhat frayed in recent years. So I would put more emphasis on alliance relationships and perhaps less on personal diplomacy.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And Catherine, another question has come through for you that talks and asks the simple question: did the daughters of Yalta know one another before the conference, or was that the first time they met?
Sarah Churchill and Kathleen Harriman did know each other quite well before Yalta. The Harrimans had lived in London between 1941 and 1943 and were very good friends with the Churchill family, as I mentioned, celebrating Kathleen's birthday the night they find out about Pearl Harbor. Kathleen was quite close with both Sarah and Mary. And of course, there's the relationship between Averell Harriman and Pamela Churchill, Winston's daughter-in-law. And Sarah, in an attempt to keep the peace in the family, helped Kathleen to cover up for the affair so that Sarah's brother Randolph wouldn't find out about it, in the interests of peace for everyone involved. And so they did know each other very well. And Kathy had seen Sarah act in some performances earlier in the war. But they had never met Anna Roosevelt. Kathleen was very curious to meet Anna. Averell had met her on a trip to Washington, D.C., and reported back to Kathy that she was quote, a peach. And so she was very excited to meet her. But when Anna goes over to Yalta, this is the first time she's been in this type of environment. And even though she is the oldest of the daughters, she's the least experienced, especially in foreign policy, as the other two have been very much a part of the conversation around the dinner table with their fathers since 1940 and 41. And so Anna, I think, sometimes has a lack of self-confidence. And even though she is the first daughter, all the other delegates there, they know Kathy really well. The Russians, the British, the Americans, and so they almost defer to her as kind of the lead daughter in a sense because they are familiar with her. And Anna somewhat jealously guards that position and doesn't necessarily like Kathleen all the time. And but I think that speaks more about their respective sense of confidence at the time. Kathy is completely oblivious to it and thinks everybody's wonderful. So it's really interesting to see the daughters. You think of them, they're the three women there. They must kind of be a united front, a united presence, but really their loyalties are to their fathers and to their nations, and the relationships among them ebb and flow, mirroring the relationships among their fathers.
Right, right. That they all had their own special relationship and a microcosm, not a macro. But that leads me to the next question, which is about this idea of the special relationship. It's been mentioned many times in the conference. John Major mentioned it yesterday. It was mentioned today by the National Security Advisor O'Brien in Washington, and talking about the importance and relevance. And while it's ebbed and flowed, that phrase has been used many times in the last 48 hours to describe it. It is there, and it's important. This conference, this church, is in ways a symbol of that special relationship and the ability of the English-speaking peoples, as Churchill put it in the speech here at Westminster College, to remain allies and be friendly on a cultural level, on a legal level, on a moral level. What do we think, about the state of the special relationship today? I know, David, you've written extensively on this, including a very thoughtful piece a number of months ago in I believe, the Wall Street Journal about this topic. And with your book on the summits and the relationships of the various presidents, perhaps you can give your assessment of the special relationship today.
Okay, well, when I've tried to think about this, I try and break the word down, because obviously it's used as in a propagandistic way quite often, particularly by British governments. But it seems to me it's important to distinguish between special in quality and special in importance. Meaning by that, special in importance is, and it refers particularly to this Churchill-Roosevelt period, the fact that although Britain was a junior partner in that relationship by the end of the war, Britain was still a global power with a major navy, a substantial air force, with conscription that lasted through the 1950s, which meant that it was able to mobilize an army beyond its weight. And still, though with economic problems after the war, a major power economically. It's often forgotten that in, say, 1952, British output is the same as France and West Germany combined. So Britain was still a global power. It also had bases all over the world, which mattered to the United States as America got into the Cold War. Now, that specialness in importance has waned dramatically since the days of Churchill. Nevertheless, there's specialness in quality, which is still there, was there in the war, and is still there. For example, the intelligence relationship, which has been mentioned during the conference, and grow out of the sharing of intelligence during the war, that has continued and is essential still to the kind of structure of Western relations and information sharing. The nuclear relationship remains special in the sense that Britain has unusual access to American nuclear technology. Not something that, because we played a major part in the bomb project initially, and then we've since later on acquired Polaris and then Trident technologies. And also, most important, what I call the consultative relationship, which is the sort of fact, and this is where the common language does matter, the fact that British and American diplomats, service personnel, whatever, routinely in the old days of landline phones, just pick up the phone and talk to Washington or to London, and just kind of get a sense of what the take is. And of course, one of the questions now with Britain moving into Brexit is whether the changing relationship with the continent of Europe in terms of economics and politics is going to affect that strategic relationship as well. But I would say that although the relationship is no longer special in importance in that global sense of the Churchill era, it's still important in quality in some of the ways I've just mentioned.
Right. Well, thank you for that. We have just a few minutes remaining, and I think I'd like to just again thank both of you for taking time to join us from Chicago and from from the UK. This is an embodiment of technology that I think Roosevelt and Churchill might have liked to have during the Second World War and afterwards. Though I think it is fair to say, as you suggested, David, that real person-to-person summits are where the real work does get done. And we all look forward to returning to a time when we can have conferences. Churchill loved conferences, and so do Churchillians. And we look forward to returning to a time when we can join one another once again in person to have these types of conferences. But I'm very grateful to you to be with us. And I would like to invite all of the viewers to continue watching and thank the generous sponsors who've made this happen. If you are still time to donate, the conference is made free by the generosity of these sponsors, but we're always looking for additional support to produce educational programs, not only here at Westminster College and America's National Churchill Museum, but throughout the International Churchill Society Alliance. So we're very much grateful for that. And one final plug for these books. If you haven't picked them up, David, your latest, The Kremlin Letters, is a must-have, and of course, Catherine, your new book, which you are now zooming on a book tour, I suppose, everywhere, The Daughters of Yalta. Please do pick these up. And I would be remiss also if I didn't make a short plug in the time that remains for another book that'll be released in 2 weeks called The Inspiring History of the Special Relationship. That's a book that the museum is publishing by one of our Churchill Fellows, Nancy Carver, that examines this topic of the special relationship through the lens of the speech that we talked about today, through the lens of bringing this church from London to Fulton in the 1960s and establishing the museum, and the long legacy of the relationship between the UK dating back 400 years. So this is a new book that's coming out. I encourage you all to pick up 3 books, not just 2, but David's, Nancy's, and Catherine's to round things out. So I will turn it over back to our friends at Cambridge in London. We're going to be seeing a number of short videos now to continue this theme of international relations by looking at some short videos produced by other Churchill groups throughout the world, not just here in the United States or in Britain, but other Churchillians who are thinking about the legacy and life of Winston Churchill, his legacy of leadership, his words that do indeed matter to this day. And once again, Catherine and David, thank you. That's all from here at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, at America's National Churchill Museum. Tim Riley, Director and Chief Curator. Thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.